Hey guys, I'm Juan Esteban Garcia with Phoenix Code, and in this video I'm gonna teach you how to build your first REST API using AWS Lambda and AWS API Gateway. This will be a very fun video in which I will show you how to build this simple API that you're seeing here. Let me demo what we're going to do. As you can see, it's pretty simple. We just have a URL here, and if I make a request to this endpoint, this is the response that I get. It's just a JSON response. It says success true, and message, it simply says hello Phoenix Code from Lambda. Now, if I add my name, so if I pass Juanes and execute it again, you see that it changes the name. Now it says hello Juanes from Lambda. So as you can see, this is a pretty simple API. I want to make it very easy because I understand that the first time that you work with Lambda or with API Gateway, it can be quite intimidating, the interface, and quite frankly, you just feel lost because, yeah, you just don't know where to start. But I will make it very easy for you in this video. I promise you that by the end of this video, you'll be able to build this exact API. And this will be like the starting point where you will be able to start building other things that are much bigger, that have a different level of complexity. So just bear with me and I will show you how to do it. The only prerequisite that we have for this video is that you must have already signed up on AWS Lambda, on Amazon Web Services. So if you already have an account, that's all you need for this tutorial. It's pretty easy to create your own account. You just gotta go to aws.amazon.com, and here you see that you have a link to create an AWS account. Before we dive into the topic of this video, I wanna make sure that we all understand the concept of serverless architectures. It's a pretty simple concept. Basically, let's say that you build a website, or let's say that you create some sort of app for someone, a web app. In that case, you will have to buy some hosting, and then you'll have to upload your code, and you'll have to, in some cases, you are responsible for maintaining the server and for configuring, let's say, Apache or Nginx or PHP or any server that you use. That's usually the way it is. You are responsible for that. And if, for example, in the scenario where the server goes down, you are also responsible for figuring out what happened and fixing the server. Also, you have to perform maintenance tasks, stuff like that. But with the serverless architecture, you are just saving all the time and headache that will require you to do all the things that I just described. Because in this case, in this particular case, we're using AWS Lambda. So that means that Amazon is responsible for for spinning up a small server that executes your code, and then it simply kills the server. Okay, so it's a very simple process. So basically, your server is always asleep. But every time you get a request, it simply creates the server, then it just runs the code that we're going to create in a minute, and it's as simple as that. What that means is that you won't have to worry about configuring any servers or performing any maintenance tasks, you only need to worry about your code. That's the greatest advantage of this, that you get to focus only on the code that you write. And also another thing that I want to say is that usually these Lambda functions are just individual functions in your application code. So what that means is that you just build an individual function that does only one thing. Okay, so it's not like you're gonna have a lot of different functions, even though you can have them, but at the end of the day, your Lambda function should only do one specific task and do it well. Okay, so having said that, let's start building our API. This little diagram will show us what we're going to do here. This is our goal. Basically, every time a user makes a request to our API, the request will be made directly to Amazon API Gateway, And API gateway will be responsible for routing that request to our Lambda function. In this case, we will be using Node.js. And well, our Lambda function, for example, could make a query to a database or to another REST API. In this case, we're not gonna do any of that because we just want to keep it simple. And basically, I mean, our diagram will apply, like only the first three pictures that you see here will apply to the setup that we are going to have. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go to AWS Lambda. You can, in my case, you can see that I have it here, but you can also just search here and go to Lambda, and we're going to create a function. We have to type the function name. In this case, it will be my first Lambda function. Let's leave it like this. We're going to use Node.js 14. As you can see, they also support some older versions, such as version 10, version 12, but we're going to use Node.js 14. And it's possible to change the execution role. As you know, AWS they use roles and permissions all the time for pretty much everything you want to do here. But in this case, we're just gonna leave the default settings, and it will create a new role with basic Lambda permissions to execute the code that we're going to create. Okay, so pretty simple. Just click create function. And okay, we can see now our new function. So let's see what we got here. So, I mean, basically the first thing that you will notice is that we have a code editor. And if I click here, you see that it has a folder and a file called index.js. And as you can see, it has some default, it's just some boilerplate that they put here. This code will work. I will show you in a minute. And well, another thing that you should notice is that there is a setting here called handler, and it says index.handler. So what that means is that every time we execute this Lambda function, this is the code that it will trigger. Okay, so it says index because it's referring to the index.js file, and the handler because this is the function that we are using. It's also possible to create some other functions. I mean, you can create as many functions as you want, but you must know that any code that you create has to be triggered from this function, from the function that you reference here. Okay, so that's super important. So we're going to change this code a little bit, but before we start making any changes, let's just test this function because I want to see how it works. I want to see if what it does here. So if I click test, the first thing that it asks me to do is to configure a test event. In this case, I'm just going to type test event 1, and let's say that I'm going to pass Juan. No, actually, let's do name Juanes, and I'm not gonna pass anything else. I can pass as many parameters as I want. Of course, this is just a JSON payload. So if I hit create and hit test, you see that it does return this. So it returns a status code. In this case, it's 200 because we want to return the 200 code, which means that the request was successful and that everything went well. But it's also possible to return, let's say, a 400 code or 401 or 500. I mean, it really depends. Those are just standard HTTP codes. But in our case, we can just leave it as is. And also, here's the body. It says hello from Lambda. That's great. However, let's say that we want to see what the event parameter contains. So if I type console.log event, and I deployed this code. Remember that you have to deploy it in order to see the changes. Now if I hit test, well, you see that it returns the same, but in this line it shows us name Juanes, because this is what we were passing when we configured the test event. So in this case, since we will be using API gateway, I think it makes perfect sense to create a new test event and just simulate that this is an API gateway request. Okay, so basically what we're doing here is just simulating that the API call is coming from API gateway. And as you can see, it passes a bunch of different parameters such as the body, the resource, the path. But I mean, don't worry about all these parameters that you're seeing here. I know this can be quite confusing, but let's just focus on this one right here, which is query string parameters. In this case, I'm gonna pass name, and the name will be Juanes. And if you remember in our initial call from Postman, you remember that we were passing this parameter, name Juanes. So this is basically the parameter that we are referencing. In this case, it says query string parameter because this is this is just a query that we have in the URL. So this is the way that we reference parameters that we may pass in the URL. All right, so with that said, let's just type API gateway, create, and that's all. Pretty simple. Now let's change the code because we need to be able to access that information. So the first thing that we want to do is to, actually let's leave this console here, it might be useful later. As you can see, we're gonna read the name, so we will read it from the URL, but if no parameter is passed, then we're just going to use Phoenix code. As you can see, we're using the optional chaining operator, which is actually quite useful because that way we will, I mean, if for example, the user doesn't pass this parameter in the URL, then this will return an error. But in this case, it won't because we are using the optional chain operator. All right, the second thing that we want to do is, well, in my case, I want to return this message, hello, blah, 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 from Lambda, and also the success attribute that simply means that the request went well, and here's your response. And well, in this case, you can see that we have to pass the body, but we need to convert this JSON string into just a string. I mean, it cannot be JSON, so that's why we use this JSON.stringify function. But in this case, I'm gonna replace this with body because I want to return what I defined here. All right, so let's deploy these changes. Now if I test, in this case I want to make sure that we're using API gateway, and if I test this function, you see that it does say hello Juanes from Lambda. In this case it looks a bit weird because we're using the JSON.stringify function. And also you can see that here in the console we are displaying the parameters that we're getting from API gateway. I mean, in this case, this is not really coming from API gateway because this is just hard-coded based on this is just using the test event that we created before. But obviously, when we execute this, when we connect this to API gateway, we will receive a pretty similar string from API gateway. But we'll see that in a minute. All right, I think we're done with this. Let's just remove this console.log. And we're done. We just deployed the changes. Now it's time to start working on API gateway. So let's go now to API gateway. And as you can see, since I don't have any APIs in this region that I'm using, in this case I'm using North California, I'm just going to choose an API type. In this case, I'm going to create a REST API. Okay, so this is what I'm going to choose. Build. And as you can see, it gives me an example API that uses Swagger. In case you don't know Swagger is basically a very nice tool that you can use for documenting your APIs. As you can see, it even gives you an option to import an existing API, but in this case, we won't be using any of this. We're just trying to keep it simple. And in the new API, we're just going to choose that we're going to create a new API. The API name will be my first API. And the description, well, I'm not going to type anything in the description. And in the endpoint type, as you can see, we have three different options. Basically, the first one, the one that we're going to use, is just regional API, which means that the API will only be deployed to the current region that I'm using. In this case, is this one, the one that I showed you. But it's, I mean, in case I want to use a CDN, and let's say that I want to deploy this to the cloud from network, it might be useful to do that in some cases, because that means that if someone is trying to make a call to this URL from, let's say, South Africa or somewhere else, then Amazon will try to serve the content from the closest location available. That means that the API will be faster and the response time will be obviously much faster. In this case, we're just gonna use a regional. We're gonna choose a regional for the endpoint type. And well, this is our API. As you can see, it doesn't contain any endpoints yet, but that's what we're gonna do now. So the first thing that we want to do, so if we go back to Postman, you will see that we have this endpoint that says hello. That's exactly what we're gonna do here. So we're going to create a resource that will be called hello. And I mean, in case you want to use a single page application, in some cases it's actually quite useful to enable this API gateway course. I mean, I'm not gonna elaborate on this, but basically it's just something that will create an options endpoint. And so every time your browser makes a request to this API to validate that you're able to make calls, then it will always provide a response. But again, that's a different topic, so I'm not gonna waste time on this for now. And I'm just gonna create the resource. Okay, we have the resource now, but we need to specify AWS the method that we want to use, because I mean, we have this resource, but for example, we can use one Lambda function in case it's a delete request, or in case it's or another one in case it's a get request, or head, or options, or patch, etc. Or even you can use any, which means that if you use delete or get or options or patch or whatever, it will always use the same Lambda function or the same server that you configure for this endpoint. In this case, we're just gonna keep it simple. We're gonna use get, and now we want to choose the integration point, which means that this is what will be called when a request comes to this particular endpoint that we're setting up. So in this case, I want to use a Lambda function. As you can see, we can use HTTP. We can even use mock in case we want to return just a specific output, or in case we want to process the data in any way. But yeah, we're just gonna use Lambda function. And very important, we need to use the Lambda proxy integration, because if you remember, as you can see here, it says that request will be proxied to Lambda with request details available in the event of your handler function. So I don't know if you remember that when we were creating the Lambda function, there was an event variable that we were using to obtain the parameters that were passed in the URL. So it's actually very important to use this, because that way we will populate that variable and we will pass all the different headers and the path and all the information available in the request. So Lambda region, we're just gonna leave the one that we have here. And now I'm just gonna type the name of the function that I'm gonna use, my first Lambda function. And I'm gonna use the default timeout, which is 29 seconds, I think. I'm gonna hit save, and you are about to give permission to API gateway, okay. And voila, pretty simple. Now we're going to deploy this API, because basically what you're seeing here, even though we already did our work, now we need to create a URL that can be publicly accessible, and that's the URL that we're going to use to make our API calls. So it asks me to select a deployment stage. In this case, I mean, we can have, let's say, one for dev, another one for staging, or for test, another one for production, QA, whatever. I mean, you can have as many as you want. In this case, we're only going to create one for production. The description will be, the description of this stage will be production environment or production API. And the description will be, the deployment description will be my first version. I mean, you don't even have to type any of this. It's just that I want to do it. So if I hit deploy, well, you can see that it takes me to this stages page. This is where we were doing our work. Now we are in this page, and we have pro, and well, we have this new invoke URL. This is the URL that we will be using to make our HTTP requests. And one thing to notice is that you can also use your own domain. So for example, it's a convention that we use to, for example, set up a subdomain, something like api.myserver.com, and just use that instead of this ugly URL. But for the purpose of this video, this is just enough. So this is what we're gonna use. All right, so if I open this URL in my browser, you see how it says missing authentication token. But if I go, well, just so you know, this is what you will always see when you don't have like a specific endpoint configured. But if we go to hello, we see a different response. It says success, and it shows us the message. So if I copy this URL and I go to Postman and hit send, you see that it works very well. Yeah, it provides like a lot of information, it uses JSON, etc. And also, if, for example, here in the query parameters we pass Juanes, hit send, you see that it works well. Actually, let's change this to YouTube. And it works. I mean, we can do the same thing from our browser. If I type this, it shows us the same output. So as you can see, it works pretty well, and we were able to create our first API. Just to recap, this is the setup that we did. So basically we have API gateway, which is pretty much the one responsible for routing all the requests to the function that we created. And this is the end user. So as you can see, everything is working pretty well. Okay, this is as far as we can go today. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I invite you to subscribe to this channel, because I will be posting more videos about this topic, because this is actually something very important these days. Thank you so much for your time.